Hi, it's me. Welcome to another Limbus Company E.G.O ID overview. You'll notice that I didn't say new this time, and that this next update's ID hasn't been released yet. Well, that's because the E.G.O and ID I'm going over in this video have been in the game for some time now. In the case of the Christmas Nightmare E.G.O, I didn't make an overview at the time because I just didn't feel like I had anything interesting to say about them. In the 10 months since their release, at least one of them has become a staple in one archetype, and in the case of Corp, E.G.O, Contempt, or Ryoshu, I was playing Hollow Knight Silksong, so can you really blame me? In any case, there's going to be some amount of retrospective for these, at least from my point of view. We've had some time to sit on these, so I won't be talking about them as if they've just come out. With all that out of the way, let's get right into it. To begin with, let's look at Gregor's Christmas Nightmare E.G.O. This E.G.O is a 12 to 20 rolling / sloth skill with 2 coins and 5 attack weight. It is a combination of being a Tremor and Sinking E.G.O, triggering Tremor Burst with its first coin and dealing additional damage to enemies below 0 SP by how low their SP is. That being said, I would say its best utility is in the fact that it can inflict debuffs to enemies. If a target is staggered, in low morale, or is panicked, it will inflict 1 attack power down, as well as 1 fragile, matching the highest resonance, for the next turn to those enemies, much like Otis's Holiday E.G.O. The same coin also heals a minimum of 3% of Gregor's missing HP per target hit, and that value increases with your highest resonance up to 30% total. It would have been really cool if this effect could fully heal him, because after this skill is used, if Gregor is at full HP, it will also heal 15 SP at the end of the turn, or 75% of the E.G.O's SP cost, and grant 1 attack power up next turn. Especially for how many resources the E.G.O costs, it feels like it would have been a fair effect to have. The passive will inflict either 1 offense level down or 1 defense level down to all enemies at combat start for every enemy that is staggered, in low morale, or panicked, up to 2 times per turn. This is actually a really solid passive, as being able to clash better or deal more damage is always a good effect. It's just really unfortunate that it's random, since getting 1 of both on every enemy is never the preferable permutation for the effect. This is definitely the least useful of the 3 things I'm talking about in this video, but the E.G.O itself is far from useless. If you're not fighting for a He slot on Gregor, it's a really solid inclusion in most Tremor teams at least. The Corrosion is a 22 to 10 rolling / sloth E.G.O with 2 coins and 5 attack weight. Effect-wise, it is almost exactly the same as the Awakening, with the one exception being that it heals 10 HP before being used, so it is actually possible to reach full health from the E.G.O itself. Beyond that, it heals 20 SP at turn end if at full HP, which is technically a smaller percentage of the SP cost, and inflicts an additional fragility for the highest resonance if the second hit conditional is met. Since it's so similar to the Awakening, I don't feel like shelling out 12 resources would be worth it for this particular skill, unless you really think that that extra point of fragility is going to make the difference during the fight. In terms of what IDs are best used with this E.G.O, Gregor has 3 IDs that are capable of fueling 3 out of the 4 necessary resources to use it. Those IDs are LCB Center Gregor, Zwei Association South Section 4 Gregor, and Twin Hook Pirates First Mate Gregor. Despite this, I wouldn't necessarily say that any of these IDs are good users of this E.G.O. None of them match the status effect it provides, and the only one capable of healing himself is LCB Sinner, and while there's nothing wrong with using base IDs, it usually isn't the optimal strategy. If I had to guess which of the 3 is best, I would say Zwei Gregor was, because he at least plays well in a Tremor team. Edgar Family Butler Gregor does at least synergize with Sinking, and getting enemies to low SP is really easy in a Sinking team nowadays. However, Sinking setups are going to see it compete with Solemn Lament for players that have it, which, while it has problems, I would say is pretty much always better in Sinking because it is both gloom and easier to fuel. It really stinks that Gregor lacks a good Tremor ID, because that would be the best ID to use with this E.G.O. It being Sloth means you can use it to trigger with the Tremor Resonance type, and it triggering Tremor Burst means it's a good way to deal damage in the same team. We'll just have to wait for that ID to come out for this E.G.O to really shine. Moving on now, we have Ishmael's Christmas Nightmare, which is the better of the 2. This He E.G.O is a 12 to 22 rolling blunt sloth skill with 2 coins and 3 attack weight. It shares the same low SP damage conditional as its sister E.G.O, but other than that actually works quite differently. The first coin conditionals that aren't inflicting a ton of tremor count only activate if the target is not staggered, in low morale, or panicked. In this case, it inflicts 5 sinking, as well as triggering Tremor Burst twice, and that's on top of triggering another burst on the second coin. To make it more clear that this is meant to be a Tremor E.G.O, it also gains 5 to 10 tremor count for the user on use, which is almost exclusively found on Tremor IDs. After the attack concludes, it also heals 10 SP if any of its targets are staggered, in low morale, or panics, which is a 50% refund of the SP used by the skill. It doesn't take much deduction to realize that 3 Tremor Bursts is potentially an ass load of damage if you're using a Tremor Reverb or Tremor Scorch setup, so this E.G.O is unmatched in Tremor teams specifically for the purpose of damage. On top of that, the passive makes it so that twice per turn, when an ally gains Tremor count, they gain 1 more of it, and that amount doubles if their current target is staggered, in low morale, or panicked. This is really helpful for some IDs that are a bit slower to generate tremor count, such as T-Corp Otis or, well, it's actually just T-Corp Otis, but it is helpful. The Corrosion is an 18-3 rolling blunt sloth skill with 3 coins and 5 attack weight that becomes a 20-5 if the target is staggered, in low morale, or panicked. Not unlike Gregor's E.G.O, this one just builds on the same effects as the Awakening, while also healing 10 HP before use, except that makes less sense for this variant since it doesn't actually gain any benefits from being at max HP. In this case, it also gains a 4th Tremor Burst unconditionally, and divides the conditional Tremor Burst evenly between the second and third coin. Under the conditionals, the first coin inflicts 2 sinking count, and at the maximum it can restore 25 SP after being used if every one of its targets is staggered, in low morale, or panicked. It is genuinely one of the best E.G.O to use in its overclocked state, at least in its own archetype, since very few E.G.O break the 4 Tremor Burst threshold. It's also great to use with the Superbia effect, since it's a 5-target E.G.O that has 3 coins, meaning its raw damage is incredibly good, but it shines best as a Tremor E.G.O first and foremost. When it comes to perfectly fueling this E.G.O, Ishmael doesn't actually have anything perfect. Everything stops at 2 Sin Affinities needed. At the very least, all of her sinking IDs hit that mark, so both Edgar Family Butler and Moeller Boatworks Fixer both make decent use of it if you just want to use it alongside a sinking team for high damage. That said, it is pretty unquestionable that the best user of this E.G.O is Vi Association West Section 3 Ishmael. She's quite possibly one of the strongest Tremor IDs in the entire game, and uses self-tremor, so the E.G.O benefits her in that regard as well. She has great tremor generation of her own, and her gimmicks mean that she will probably not be the one to gain the bonus tremor count from the passive, which is actually a good thing since she already generates it well by herself. And her not having a sloth skill means that this E.G.O even has bonus utility with her by allowing her to participate in sloth resonance for tremor effects. But if you don't have her, you can use LCCB Assistant Manager in the meantime, who also fuels 2 out of the 3 necessary resources. Lastly, we arrive at N-Corp E.G.O Contempt R Ryōshū, a triple-odd ID that has been out for a little over a month now. Her kit revolves around 2 unique status effects. Well, actually there's 5, but we'll get to the other 3. The most important 2 are Gaze and Contempt. Both of these effects only have an effect when the unit that has them is interacting with Ryōshū. Gaze stacks up to 7 and causes the unit to deal and take 10% more damage from and against Ryōshū, and transfers to an ally with the least of it if the unit dies, except if that death is caused by Ryoshu's enhanced skill 3. If the stack is at 7, it instead becomes Contempt at turn end, which reduces damage taken and dealt from and against Ryōshū by 50% and transfers under the same conditions. At turn end, it will become 7 Gaze, despite Contempt only stacking up to 1. Every one of Ryoshu's skills inflicts Gaze, so until it reaches the maximum stack, her damage is going to be quite high, and her HP is going to drain quite quickly if she ends up being hit. Her main passive facilitates this. For 2 Lust Resonance, you inflict 2 Gaze on the first hit of the turn, and 1 more if Ryōshū has Gaze of Contempt. It also inflicts Gaze up to 3 times per turn when being hit by an enemy, and if Ryōshū has Contempt of the Gaze, the attacker takes up to 20 Sloth damage after the skill ends as well, up to 60 damage total per turn. And lastly, if Ryōshū's skills consume Gaze or Contempt from the target, she gains up to 6 Gaze of Contempt based on how much was consumed, so it's probably a good idea to talk about those 2 statuses as well. Gaze of Contempt and Contempt of the Gaze were introduced with the E.G.O of the same name as this ID. Gaze of Contempt lets Ryoshu deal 7% more damage per stack until the end of the turn. However, if it has 7 stacks, instead of expiring, it will become Contempt of the Gaze. It gives Ryoshu 7 protection, 7 damage down, and 20 aggro for a random skill slot at the start of the turn. She also has 2 other passives. The first one gives her 4 protection while staggered, as well as giving Contempt of the Gaze on the next turn once per encounter. This is to synergize with another unit that we'll get into in a moment. Also, when she dies, she inflicts these effects in order from the unit who has the most Gaze or Contempt in descending order: 2 bind, 2 bleed and a bleed count, and 2 tremor and a tremor count. I'm still iffy on effects that require the ID to die, but this ID is kinda meant to function like that anyways, which is why she's really fragile unless functioning under Contempt. Lastly, she has a unique passive that only functions if Corp E.G.O Fell Bullet Yi-Sang is on the field. If Yi-Sang is going to use his skill 3 and Ryoshu can act, she will use her skill 1 against the main target of Yi-Sang's skill 3 before it goes off, but at 50% less damage, generating 1 additional resource and making it easier to kill Yi-Sang's target with his skill 3. However, if Ryoshu has Contempt of the Gaze, Yi-Sang will use a different skill 3 entirely. It's almost exactly the same as his usual one, except it always targets Ryoshu and the first coin doesn't forcibly treat Ryoshu's defenses as 2x. It's going to sound weird coming from me, but I actually really like this interaction, and I pretty frequently use these two together when I'm playing a bleed team nowadays. And finally, we have her support passive. For 3 Lust Resonance, the earliest deployed ally will inflict 1 bleed on hitting each enemy once per turn, inflicting 1 bleed count as well if they already had bleed. They also inflict 1 tremor to the attacker on being hit, and 1 tremor count if the attacker already had tremor. It's actually not a bad support passive in bleed, as more count is more count, but I find it not that useful for tremor setups, unfortunately. Her defense skill is to Grasp, a 10 to 15 rolling sloth guard that becomes a 20 to 25 if she has Contempt of the Gaze. Upon being used, she inflicts 1 bleed count to the attacker up to 3 times per turn, which is quite solid actually, but more importantly, if there is at least 7 total Gaze on all enemies, or if any enemy has Contempt, she will gain Contempt of the Gaze as long as she doesn't already have it. This is her main way to gain this effect, and timing it to use Yi-Sang's skill 3 is quite easy and practical to do. That being said, it's really the only use case for this defense skill in my opinion, despite the bleed count making an enemy attack effectively bleed neutral when directed at her. Contemptuous Thing is a 3 to 11 rolling Pierce Envy skill with 2 coins that can become up to a 3 to 15 based on the target's bleed and tremor, and gains 1 clash power if the target has Gaze or Contempt. All of her skills inflict at least 1 tremor and bleed count, as well as inflicting some amount of Gaze. She also clashes quite well on all skills, which helps out a lot for an ID that is primarily going to be dealing a high amount of damage. Be Odd is a 4 to 16 rolling Pierce Wrath skill with 2 coins, the second being Unbreakable, that can become up to a 4 to 20 based on the target's bleed and tremor, and gains 1 clash power if the target has Gaze or Contempt. The Tremor Burst being on the Unbreakable coin is actually quite nice because it means that damage can't be negated. One thing this ID struggles a bit with is since she inflicts both tremor and bleed, she tends to inflict both in small amounts. She is not self-sufficient with tremor or bleed on her own, and will need some help from a team to supplement both. Awe Contempt is a 5 to 17 rolling Pierce Lust skill with 3 coins, the third of which being Unbreakable, that can become up to a 5 to 23 based on the target's bleed and tremor. It inflicts double the bleed and tremor potency if the target has Gaze, but otherwise inflicts the same amount as her skill 2. It also deals up to 40% more damage based on the target's bleed and tremor, and the last coin on top of always triggering a Tremor Burst deals up to 70% more damage based on the target's Gaze, and triggers amplitude conversion into Tremor Hemorrhage if the coin isn't cracked. Tremor Hemorrhage is a new amplitude introduced with this ID, but it is almost exactly the same as Tremor Scourge. The only difference is that it deals Lust damage instead of Wrath damage, and goes by the target's bleed instead of their burn for the second half of the damage conditional. It's a good effect, but there aren't enough IDs which are both bleed and tremor in order to make full use of it, since bleed tends to go away pretty fast. For now, it's just a way to make bleed still help with damage while an enemy is staggered, which is a pretty decent niche if you can take advantage of it. However, when using the skill 3 while there are 7 or more total gaze on all enemies, or if any enemy has Contempt, it will instead activate as Cascading Gaze of Awe underneath Contempt. It's a 14 to 28 rolling Pierce Lust skill with a single unbreakable coin and 3 attack weight, and can become up to a 14 to 32 based on the main target's bleed and tremor. It prioritizes enemies with Gaze or Contempt for its subtargets, but also deals only half damage against subtargets. Despite this skill deals a ridiculous amount of total damage, with up to 170% more damage from skill conditionals based on bleed and tremor of the main target, and Gaze across all targets. It also deals 235% more damage against targets who have Contempt specifically, still converts Tremor to Hemorrhage, still triggers Tremor Burst, and inflicts the same amount of bleed and tremor as the unempowered skill 3, but with 1 additional count for each. This skill will occasionally be used in any fight regardless of if you are trying to use it, but its damage is so high compared to the skill it replaces that it's pretty much always the more viable option anyways. This ID has 3 E.G.O that are perfectly fueled by it, the most important of which is Contempt Awe, unsurprisingly. Not only is it her only bleed E.G.O, but it also allows you to potentially gain Contempt of the Gaze whenever you want to without having to resort to using her defense skill, provided you can get to 6 highest resonance. On top of that, it deals really good damage, as well as makes it easier to generate resources, so it's a bit of a no-brainer to include on this ID. She perfectly fuels her own base E.G.O in Forest of the Flames, and since this ID is already dealing a bunch of extra damage thanks to Gaze, the fragile it inflicts is going to be really helpful for amplifying that damage even further. And she also perfectly fuels Red Eyes Open, which is still Ryōshū's best E.G.O for clashing, and can also provide a decent amount of healing as well as some attack power up to herself. Every one of these new things spoken about in this video relate to Tremor, so I would first like to relate the new Ryōshū to the bleed IDs that she works well with. The ID itself is not bad in bleed teams by any means, especially since the Contempt Awe E.G.O is best in that framework. Running her alongside any of the good bleed IDs will always be a good plan. Specifically, Kurakuma's Heathcliff and Ishmael, as well as all of the Blood Fiend IDs are going to be great partners for her, most likely including the new one that's coming out soon. They inflict a ton of bleed, and this ID can help to keep that bleed built up somewhat without holding them back. And Corp E.G.O Fell Bullet Yi Sang is also pretty great with this ID, and only with this ID, as I would say she is the only thing making him worthwhile to bring in a non-mirror dungeon scenario. He's a rather solid ID on his own, but the support she provides for him is the big thing keeping him afloat. Lastly, if your goal is to hybridize Bleed and Tremor together, you're probably going to want both Ring IDs. There's only one other ID outside of these 3 who can inflict both, and I wouldn't exactly call N-Corp Inquisitor Don Quixote a good ID for this point of the game's lifespan. You'll need to build mostly for Bleed, however, since Tremor is a lot easier to maintain overall. When it comes to Tremor teams, you're likely bringing Zwei Ishmael anyways, so I won't linger too much on her as the best user of Christmas Nightmare. Aside from her, Thumb Sinclair and Merceau are great for any Tremor team if you're just looking for units that roll really high. They do insane amounts of damage, and neither Scorch nor Hemorrhage are going to be your best option for damage anyways. The best way to utilize both is to combine them together under Tremor Superposition. The best way to do that is to include Regret Faust and using Everlasting at the start of the turn. Not only will this allow you to apply both at once, but it'll make you burst Tremor even more, which is even more damage. And hey, you can even throw Tremor Reverb into the mix by including Yuradivi Honglu and using his Cavernous Wailing E.G.O. Reverb only goes off of the Tremor amount, so it's the most damage you can include under a superposition if you can actually get them all there in the first place. Heisho Pak Wu Branch Yi Sang is also a great Tremor unit despite his lack of Tremor E.G.O, especially because he has a lot of Sloth E.G.O, so despite not having any Tremor E.G.O, he can still contribute to Sloth Resonance very easily. Plus, his skills are all incredibly good overall anyways. You should also have a Tremor unit on Otis, and for that purpose you can include either T-Corp or Molar Otis because they are about as effective as each other. T-Corp is probably more consistent overall, but Molar has more unique sin affinities, and also discard means you get her better skills more often. And if you'd rather use Time Moratorium, you can always incorporate the other 2 T-Corp IDs at your leisure. And that's all I have to say about them. You can shard them now, and for Ryoshu it's definitely worth it. Ishmael's E.G.O is worth it if you have Zwei Ishmael, And Gregor's you can probably wait on, but it'll be pretty good once he has a good Tremor ID. You can use all 3 from my company if you'd rather test them out before getting them. I know it was a bit late, but I'm interested in hearing your opinions on them nevertheless. Thank you for watching my video, I hope you have a good rest of your day, and I hope to see you again soon.